Hi, my name is Sid Melcher. Welcome everybody to the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts' second Instant Issues online event. We have folks from all across the country, not just our members and friends. So a special welcome to all of you who are calling in from afar. I'm Sid Melcher. I'm executive director of the council, and I'll say this is my first time running the technical side of things, so I apologize in advance for anything that goes wrong. If our speaker suddenly starts speaking French or grows antlers or something, it's going to be my fault. I apologize. I want to thank our Instant Issues sponsors, series sponsors, Glen Meadow, Greenfield Savings Bank, Wilbraham and Munson Academy, and Sir Speedy. And we are grateful to Concilium Opus for helping to underwrite our Zoom account as we drag ourselves into the 21st century as fast as our 94-year-old legs will carry us. We are also pleased to be able to continue to partner with Valley Eye Radio, which will broadcast the audio of this, assuming I managed to figure that out right, to their listeners with vision and impairment and print disabilities. This event is 10 years in the making. Lisa Napoli is a friend and classmate of mine from Hampshire College, and we connected via the magic of Facebook in 2009, just before she published her first book, Radio Shangri-La, about her experience helping to start a radio station at the dawn of democratic rule in the Kingdom of Bhutan. Lisa's ordinarily based in LA, although she's currently hunkered down in Florida. And we tried a few times to coordinate with her East Coast trips, and it never worked out. So thanks to the pandemic and advances in technology, just in time to have her talk about her new book. So in 1981, while I was typing away for Kelly Services at various subsidiaries of United Technologies in the greater Hartford area, Lisa was an intern at a brand new enterprise called Cable News Network. Since then, she's had a long and varied career in journalism, including time reporting for American Public Media's Marketplace. Her second book, Ray and Joan, is about the late philanthropist Joan Kroc and her husband, the founding chairman of McDonald's Corporation. Today, she's going to talk about the new one, called Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News. I have read the book, or more accurately, Lisa has read it to me in the form of an audiobook, and it was a pleasure, and I'm not just saying that, and I think it will appeal to a wide range of people. So if you are interested in the modern history of broadcast journalism, or the impact of television on our culture, or yachting, or if you remember, as I do growing up, watching reruns on a snowy UHF station in your parents' basement, there's something there for you. Today, Lisa will be speaking about Ted Turner's International Awakening. I'm going to disappear for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I will come back, and Lisa will answer some of your questions. So take it away, Lisa.
Wow, what a fabulous introduction. Thank you so much. And I'm so honored that you asked me to do this and on this particular topic, because what I'm going to talk about is actually one of the most interesting parts of the book I just wrote, and also my experience in interacting with Mr. Turner's staff. So basically, I'd like to just step back in time a little bit. As Sid mentioned, Ted Turner was probably the best yachtsman of his generation. And he was running a little dinky UHF station in Atlanta, dinky in the sense that it didn't make a lot of money. It didn't go very far signal-wise, when he had this revolutionary idea of putting it on cable, allowing it to transmit in the Southeast region. And then if I was able to see you all, I would say, does anyone remember those days in the 70s? If you were down in the South, you might have known about this station that didn't play anything remarkable, except it broadcast baseball games in a regional sense. And that was revolutionary in itself. Then it was revolutionary that Ted turned on Channel 17, as it was called, all night long. Television did not stay on all night long. And then the progression kept going from there. The satellite came along. HBO was not the big, powerful force that it is now, but HBO decided to put some movies up on the satellite and experiment with that a few hours a day. And Ted heard about that. And the satellite at that moment in time, and I write quite a bit about this in the book, I was fascinated to learn about it. I didn't know how transformational the satellite was in communications. I just always assumed they were there, which obviously isn't true. So basically, Ted got this awakening with the satellite that he could broadcast to the entire nation. It did not occur to him that he could broadcast internationally at that point. CNN went through many ups and downs on its way to fruition, which is 40 years ago. On Monday is the 40th anniversary of CNN. The satellite went missing for a while. Ted Turner went missing for a while in the UK, where he was for a celebrated and deadly yacht race. Various problems came around for him. But when they finally launched on June 1st, 1980, only 2 million people in the country could see it. Because if you can remember, if you're old enough to remember back to that time, cable television was not a commonplace utility. It was basically something you had if you needed to get a television signal. News stations were just starting up. Ted was among the first that started exclusively for cable. So once CNN launched, it wasn't an instant success. It wasn't instantly available in many places. But what was very interesting was all of a sudden, in headquarters in Atlanta, they started to receive mail from people outside of the United States, in the Caribbean, partially. They got mail from people asking questions, and it was very curious to them. How were those people receiving this signal? Well, it turns out that they were just hoisting cable into the trees and able to capture the signal. That's how cable started, and basically steal the CNN signal. Well, one of the most, or the most famous person doing this in 1981 was Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was stealing the CNN signal, and there was a reporter named Mike Betcher, young guy from Oklahoma, had his big break working for CNN. He wanted to get out of Oklahoma and go national, and by a series of coincidences, he did. He got this job. He was the first on-air reporter hired, the only one working out of Atlanta. And so as a result, because of the simmering tensions in the early 80s with the new Reagan administration and Fidel, Mike was often down in that region and in Cuba for just news stories. One day he was there, it was May Day, 1981, and someone came up to him. Of course, there were minders all over. And the minder said, our president would like to meet your president. And he thought that meant that the president of Cuban television wanted to meet his president, which was a man named Reese Schoenfeld, the founding president of CNN. And the man corrected Mike, and he said, no, Fidel Castro wants to meet Mr. Ted Turner. So thus an invitation was issued. A formal invitation was issued. Mike went back to Atlanta, and in Atlanta, he went to Ted Turner and said, I have this note for you, and perhaps you'll consider coming to see Mr. Castro. Ted Turner at that point in the 80s, in the 70s, was a conservative. He was a Republican. He wasn't politically active. He was married to another woman named Jane, not Jane Fonda yet. He had met Jane Turner at a Republican Party function, a party. Basically, he met she was his second wife. And he was not somebody who would be naturally curious or sympathetic with Mr. Castro's point of view. But nonetheless, he decided to accept the invitation. He was so dazzled by the idea that this cable channel that he'd started, and I'll step back for a second. Ted Turner was not a news guy. He didn't start CNN because he had this passion for news. He was not a journalist. He said that many times. But he really started CNN as a way to use this marriage of cable and satellite to extend his media reach that he'd started with Channel 17. And news was just the simplest thing to create. So now all of a sudden, he has a world leader, controversial world leader, to put it mildly, issuing him an invitation and asking him to come visit. And he did. He was nervous. Ted Turner didn't get nervous very often. He joked before he went, maybe this guy wants to kidnap me. Now, stepping back, you may recall that Barbara Walters, a very famous journalist in the 1970s, a groundbreaking female journalist, a very well-paid one too, had been to visit Fidel in the mid-70s, and all went well with her. I don't think that Ted Turner probably knew that because he didn't watch a whole lot of broadcast television, but nonetheless, he decided to go. And he brought with him his girlfriend, not his wife, and Mike Betcher and a couple of other folks, a camera crew, and they didn't know what they were stepping into. Well, it turns out what they were stepping into was Mr. Castro saying to them, I really appreciate CNN. I think it's an incredible service. I want to thank you for it. I want to say, I'm sorry I steal it, but news is free, so I'm not really stealing it. He was very cheeky. Fidel and Ted went duck hunting and had some rum after their duck hunting. And Ted, emboldened by the rum and the cigars and the whole heady setting of Castro's private island that they were retreating on, said to Mr. Castro, I don't understand what you're trying to do in the world. Why are you interfering in various places around the world? And Mr. Castro basically set him straight and said, well, why are your government? Why is your government interfering around the world? And in that moment, when he came face to face with what he called a commie dictator, Ted Turner realized right then a couple of things, both the power of television to connect people, but the power of television to allow him to connect with other points of view. It's very ironic today when nobody wants to hear anybody's point of view other than their own without attacking them, sadly, especially on television. But Ted Turner had this awakening in coming face to face with Fidel and recognizing, as he said, that Fidel had kids, he liked his cigars, he liked his duck hunting, he loved his family, he just looked at the world differently. And from that moment on, Ted recognized the power of what he'd built, and it was transformational for him. He decided that he needed to find a way to make CNN international. Now, at that time, in the early 80s, that was not a simple thing. The satellite enabled a lot, but as was happening in this country, all around the world, various places were being wired for cable, and of course, they're in immensely complex, I don't have to tell this audience, matrix of laws and attitudes toward mass media coming in from around the world. I remember as a young woman, after I graduated from Hampshire College, going to France, and the Minitel and the whole idea that they didn't like American television coming over. It's all a distant memory now in the age that we live in, even when you're dealing with countries like Cuba or China, the whole globalization because of media. But Ted Turner was instrumental in that, for good or bad. We could talk about that. But I wanted to write this book and was dazzled by the story because I knew very little, even though I worked there, as Sid said, as a young woman, dumb kid from Brooklyn, lucked into an internship that nobody wanted because nobody knew what CNN was then. Cable was not in New York City, so I couldn't go home and watch it in Brooklyn. But I was just very curious at this stage in my life to go back and look at the roots of how this international force got built, because it wasn't intentional, as many things that get built and become so altering to the world were not. It was not a calculated decision on Ted Turner's part to dominate the world dialogue or even the national dialogue. It really was an experiment with technology. And I just would like also to share before I open up for questions that I kept hearing from Mike Betcher, the reporter in particular, who was very generous with his time, about the video of Ted Turner and Fidel Castro in Cuba right before they left after their 3 or 4 days there. And, I'd read newspaper accounts that Fidel Castro had taped the equivalent of a commercial endorsement for CNN. And Ted brought this tape back with some stuffed ducks as mementos and a box of Cuban cigars that Fidel had given him. He brought this all back, and his people, his top line people at CNN said, there is no way we are running a commercial on the air of our brand new, at that point, year-old channel, with Fidel Castro endorsing CNN. That's absurd. We can't do that. And Ted was very angry, but he deferred to his wise broadcast executives. But I had heard that this tape existed. And of course, I wanted to get my grubby little hands on it to see exactly what was said in it. And Mike Betcher couldn't find it. The cameraman never responded to my email. And as far as I knew, there was one other copy of this tape. There might be one at CNN, and this is an unauthorized history of CNN, so I did not have help from CNN. If it does exist at CNN, I don't know where it is. So finally, I just contacted Ted Turner's office, and I said, I'd be curious if you have it. And they sent me a list of the archival video that they have. I also contacted the girlfriend of Ted, who was it was not a secret that this woman was his girlfriend. She was ultimately his employee at CNN, and she was very generous with some photographs. But the Turner folks very generously made a copy, which I promised not to copy, of this video. And I got to see it myself. Ted Turner and Fidel Castro in a television, in the Cuban television station, and then later in Fidel's office, standing by a TV with CNN playing on this old-fashioned TV, and the two men standing around, and Ted with a shit-eating grin, pardon my language, smiling like mad. Here I am. People have made fun of me and called me the mouth of the South, and he was a crazy, crazy guy. And here he is standing next to the avowed enemy of the United States, who's saying, Ted, you got it. Good guy, good work, guy. So that's my Fidel story. And I'd love to hear any questions that you have about the making of CNN or memories that you have of it. From there, his series of executives went around the world and brokered deals with various nations. Often CNN entered various nations in a more upscale way, in very fancy hotels, or for the government. It wasn't necessarily available to the people as it is in so many places today. But so that's a whole story in itself that I don't know as much about, but I know there were a couple people whose job it was to negotiate those deals on behalf of Ted. So
thank you, Lisa.
Yeah.
We have one question, which is from Paul Provencher, who says, I remember CNN during the Mideast War to liberate Kuwait from the Iraqi government. Would that be the event that made CNN as a network?
It's a great question. So what's so interesting about this story, and I as a career media person really found it interesting too, is that in my mind, yes, that was the thing that, the boys from Baghdad, that's what put CNN on the map. But it was more of a slow, gradual inculcation into the American mindset. Most notably, the first notable event was when the president, Reagan, was on the other side of John Hinckley's bullets. And that was a milestone. Then there was the shuttle Challenger was a milestone. Then there was the little girl in the well in Midland, Texas. And then it was Tiananmen Square. You may recall that. They did landmark coverage there. Some terrific books written about that, and Baghdad, of course. But yes, so it happened incrementally as the nation was getting wired for cable and more enamored of cable. We were learning to become a nation of news junkies, and events that would not normally have been telecast blow by blow all of a sudden were available to us in our living rooms. And yes, but that moment in Baghdad was, for many people, the shining moment in their journalism, but also a moment of acceptance worldwide.
Do you want to talk a little bit about Ted Turner and the Goodwill Games?
Yes, that's good. So some of you may recall, and just thinking about Sid's question to focus on the internationalism of Ted Turner. Ted Turner, with this awakening, decided that he wanted to be a peacemaker. This is where the roots, that visit with Fidel and subsequent time, was where he decided that he could perhaps broker world peace. He was big, foe of nuclear arms. He worked for nuclear disarmament, and he thought that if we could just tie up with the Soviet Union, that we could perhaps erase hatred and mend fences. So that's what he did. He raised some money and started these basically games that were to sort of counteract the Olympics. And they ran for several years. They cost him a fortune. But that was a big presence for Ted Turner as well, before he gave his hallmark landmark gift, which actually was $1 billion to the United Nations Foundation, which left the United Nations Foundation scrambling because they didn't really, they weren't set up to receive the gift, nor was Ted really capable of giving the gift that he said he was going to give. It was more of a pledge. So.
We have a question about if you know if there are any other world leaders who are CNN fans.
That's a good question. I don't know offhand. I can't imagine that there weren't many who, it's there in almost every major nation now. There is an equivalent of 24-hour news, in all over the world, there are versions of CNN, as well as CNN International, which is a much more somber version, less politicized than the CNN that we see here. And I'm sure many people on this call have seen it. I watched it while I was in Bhutan, and I was shocked by how different it was. And that was even 10 years ago. But yeah, I think that as Sid Pike, the main person on Ted's behalf, who went around and negotiating these both these partnerships with other nations to get their news so that they could do these world reports that Ted started in the 80s that were eye-opening and transformational in the sense of broadcasting, because most of us hadn't seen international news as reported by people in other nations before. Certainly not readily, and certainly not, from our living rooms in the United States. So I don't know about any world leaders in particular, but I do know that there were broadcasters around the world who were dazzled by this viewpoint, but also his sourcing of various viewpoints in other countries to see how other people produce their news.
Okay, here's a question from our mutual friend Liz in Arizona. How do you see 24-hour news affecting reactions to and consequences of events today? For example, the coronavirus crisis or the Minneapolis murder?
Hi, Liz. Yes, I think a lot about this as I'm promoting this book, how it's just, I don't even know what to say about the polarizing force that all media have become. It makes me incredibly sad. And yet at the same time, what happens because of information availability and the power of this, which is a TV studio in our hands, to capture bad behavior and transmit it. I don't have an answer. I just think as a journalist, selfishly, that I'm happy not to be reporting the daily news because it would mean being glued to a Twitter feed 24 hours a day. But also, I think it just opens up a dialogue and a need for media literacy. I wish we could teach kids how to understand how to read what they see on the media. In Bhutan, that's what they did. When television came in 1999, they realized this is a very invasive force. We better teach people how to think about that force that's coming into your home at this time. I don't know that they've had anybody better luck than we have, but there are people who are behind that movement to get people to step back and think about the impacts, the consequences of such speed. But that's a non-answer to Liz's question, in the sense that I of course it accelerates news and information, the flow of news and information. Does it make it better? Does it help that I can sit here online and get every last COVID statistic imaginable and source it and slice and dice it for myself as a layperson? I don't know. I don't know. Am I a better person, a more informed citizen because of that? I wonder about that all the time.
Okay, here's another question. How do you reestablish credibility in the news?
Wow. You know, I think about that all the time too. And I don't know what the answer is. I feel really sad about it. You know, I don't know the answer. If I knew the answer, I wouldn't have got out of journalism. I would have gone into management, but I couldn't handle that back when I was in that world. And now the best way I can think about doing it is to write about history. Right now I'm writing a book about the early history of NPR in advance of its 50th anniversary next year. And, you know, looking at how educational media came up, it's similar to looking at how 24-hour news came up, looking back and reflecting on how things used to be. You know, the bad old times were that there were 3 networks. They had 3 half-hour newscasts each night at 6:30 that pervade very similar rosters of stories. And that was frustrating for different reasons. You know, you could only get that point of view that was very similar from a bunch of older white men populated by a certain sort of educational level of people in the newsrooms. There wasn't a lot of inclusion and diversity back then. So, you know, it's not like it was necessarily better. And I write a lot about that in this book because Ted Turner's first president had been crusading to get more news produced before he got the chance to work with Ted Turner, and his frustrations were really interesting. So yeah, I wish I knew the answer.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. I'd like to thank you very much, Lisa, for taking the time out of your day. We need to get Lisa ready to go on NPR. So we have to be very careful about our time. I'd like to thank everybody for participating. We're hoping to have a couple more of these programs, 1 or 2, over the course of maybe June, so keep watching. And also tonight at 9 o'clock is week 2 of our Global Trivia Challenge. It's being organized by Rich Rediker. So if you are a World Affairs Council member, you should have received a link to that today. So thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you everybody else. Goodbye.
Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.